Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Angelique Young, and I am the Executive Vice President here at the Truman National Security Project and Truman Center for National Policy. I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today for what promises to be a really fascinating conversation. I'm going to hand it over to these panelists to get started here pretty quickly, but I do just want to kick things off by thanking our partner in this, Coinbase, for co-sponsoring this really critical series on tech and national security. And just a reminder that the views of the panelists who are going to be speaking with you here today are their own unless otherwise represented to be on behalf of their institution. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our moderator, Professor Austin Campbell, to get things started.
Thank you very much. I will start by also saying I'm not formally speaking for NYU in any capacity here. My views are also my own if I express any, but I am not the important person here. So there's going to be a 4-part roundtable series on tech and national security. It will be anchored around blockchain, digital assets, AI, and the respective intersections with U.S. national security. And I'm thrilled to be moderating the panel today because we have 3 exceptional panelists. So to start, let's go through and do some quick intros so everybody knows who we're dealing with here. Court, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Austin. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Court Hillman. I am a director in Coinbase's financial crimes compliance team. I cover new product development for DeFi and on-chain products, as well as a new asset review for assets that we support on our various platforms. Previously, I was a bank secrecy act officer for about 3 years. And before that, I was a director at a consulting firm focused on financial crime matters in fintech, correspondent banking, and offshore tax evasion through trust companies, private banks in Switzerland and the Caribbean. Good to be with you all today.
Thank you. Eitan?
Hi, thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Eitan Danon. I run the content team at Chainalysis, anything and everything on our blog, our geography of cryptocurrency report, crypto crime report. I've been at the company for 3 years. Before that, I was in a financial diplomacy role at the U.S. Treasury Department, working with Middle Eastern central banks as well as the Federal Reserve. And then before that was in a range of roles focusing on the Middle East and counterterrorism in the U.S. intelligence community.
And last but certainly not least, Robert.
Thank you, Austin. Thanks, team. Great to be with you today. My name is Robert Donovan. I'm on a gap week between jobs. I'm a crypto regulatory compliance executive. Most recently, I was chief compliance officer at a global crypto payments company. I'll be reprising a similar role in the not too distant future. Prior to that, I was a managing director at a Big Four management consulting company, focusing on regulatory remediation and compliance in traditional financial institutions as well as crypto. Germane to that, I'd spent 5 years at New York State Department of Financial Services as the deputy superintendent overseeing financial crime remediation for some of the large banks that regulator oversees. And then most importantly for this conversation, 2 years running the crypto supervisory function. So the BIT license, and that time frame included the initial approval of 2 of the stablecoins that are regulated by New York State. I came into public service from about a decade and a half worth of time in traditional finance and risk management and client-facing roles. Great to be with you all today.
All right. On that note, as we start this panel, I think one of the things that's often confused in the discourse around crypto, blockchain, and the implementation of new technology is just the basic definitions of what we're dealing with. Robert, given your background, I'm going to start by pointing this question at you and then let our other panelists fill in. But in simple terms, if I'm used to thinking of cryptocurrency primarily through the lens of something like Bitcoin, what is a stablecoin? How is it different in terms of value and functionality and how it operates?
Yeah, great question. Let's start with some contrast, right? Folks who know anything about crypto are typically familiar with some of the critiques, right? Which is that Bitcoin has no value. It has only the value that the market gives it. So stablecoins are an attempt to solve that. There's the 3 functions of money: ability to transact, store of value, and ability to denominate transactions, right? Coin fulfills maybe 1.5 of those. So it's peer-to-peer exchangeable, right? I can send Bitcoin to you, Austin, if I have your wallet address without the aid of a financial intermediary. I can store the value, whatever that is, physically, right? So I can hold all of the crypto market cap, which today is about 2.6 trillion, on a thumb drive, right? So store of value, physically being able to store that value is also something that, a unique value proposition of Bitcoin. But, what that value equates to, right? What it's used for, its monetary value equivalent is questionable, right? So stable coins are a smart contract typically written on a blockchain that purports to be worth at redemption, upon issuance and at redemption, a given value, right? Let's call it US dollar, or an ounce of gold, a troy ounce of gold, right? So these contracts, rather than being like an NFT or a special purpose token, like an attention token, their value is less determined by what someone's willing to pay for it, more determined by its functionality and the redeemability of it for a single dollar. And we see a move to recognize that the value is stable, and that these are really payment tokens. In the recent SEC pronouncement, that they don't think stable coins are securities, more along the lines of payment tokens. So that's it in a nutshell, right? It's a smart contract which you can send peer to peer. So I can send, Austin, you $1, right? If I've got your blockchain address, your wallet address, the same way that I can send a Bitcoin, but you can hold that and then take it to the issuer, right? The institution that's issued that, and redeem it for $1. And theoretically, at issuance, that issuer has taken in $1 worth of fiat currency and stored it in a manner either in federally deposit insured and potentially reinsured deposit account, or in treasury bonds, right? So the theory is something's actually backing it that makes it redeemable, so that when you take it to the counter, right, at the issuer, say, I'd like to redeem this for my $1, you can get an actual dollar back. Big difference between that and, say, Bitcoin, where there's no central counter to redeem it at, right? The value, rather than the amount of Bitcoin outstanding, is given by the original algorithm, as opposed to a treasury function that issues and redeems based on supply and demand.
No, thank you very much. I was going to say, I think there's a lot of threads to unpack in there. And one that I'm going to start with is, you gave us, I would call it, a specific definition of a stable coin, one that the NYDFS has been very comfortable with. But the unfortunate reality is the crypto ecosystem has called all sorts of things stable coins in the past, some of which have proven to be stable, some of which have not. So, Court, if I could throw it over to you, what is the taxonomy of stable coins that exist in the world as people talk about them in the wild? And then which of those have a good track record? Which should we be calling stable coins, and which maybe are something else?
Sure. So there are a few different types of stable coins to be aware of, as you've indicated, right? So there's asset-backed stable coins, which is largely what people talk about when they talk about stable coins. Specifically within asset-backed stable coins, there are three main types. So there's fiat collateralized, which is the one-to-one backing with a fiat currency like the US dollar or the euro. This is the most common type. It's, again, what people think about when they think about stable coins. There's also commodity collateralized. These are generally backed by physical assets. Most commonly, this is gold. And then there's also crypto collateralized stablecoins as well. And these are backed by other currencies and are usually over collateralized to protect against volatility. The classic example here is DAI, which is mostly backed by ETH, but also by other currencies as well. Second category is algorithmic stablecoins. These use algorithms and smart contracts to maintain price stability. So this can include automatic expansion or contraction of supply to maintain price given peg. Ampleforth is the classic example here. And then there are also hybrids. So these are a combination of the two. These can be partially backed and partially algorithmic. In general, I would say that the introduction of algorithmic factors to a stablecoin increases the risk that is associated with the asset from a risk management perspective. So that's the general view. I would say there have been algorithmic stablecoins that have had issues in the past. Terra would be the classic example for that. I think when you think about a stablecoin, the important part is how it fits into one of these three categories. And which modifier you use, asset-backed, algorithmic, or hybrid.
Thank you. And from a market's perspective, if we look at the revealed preferences of people using stablecoins over time, and certainly where we stand now in 2025, the overwhelming market preference has now been for asset-backed stablecoins. In fact, if you just take Circle and Tether, those represent together probably roughly over $200 billion of stablecoins right now, the overwhelming amount outstanding. And interestingly, in addition to being asset-backed, all of them are US dollar denominated, which brings me to my next question for Eitan, which is, how can dollar-backed stablecoins specifically reinforce the dollar's role as the preferred global settlement currency and for transactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think the conversations around the role or fate of the dollar long term seem to be inescapable. I think it's important to differentiate between the dollar as an international reserve asset, or the main one right now, and the US dollar for payments and settlement of trade. The reserve asset question, all reserve currencies, if you read your Ray Dalio or anyone else, they rise and fall. The guilder, the British pound. Will the dollar be subject to the same fate? I think that's a little bit outside the scope of today's discussion. I think what's incontrovertible, though, is that the international payment system and architecture is today a site of strategic competition and is now contested more than ever. You can call it whatever you want, the axis of disruption, upheaval, chaos, evasion. The Wall Street Journal referred to it as CRINK, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And not to scaremonger, but it's not only the future of payments that's at stake, but also big data. So interoperability with kind of alternative payment systems, and China originated, if you want to call it that, payments kind of rails or settlement kind of techniques and technology is also at stake. I think the biggest so what here is that encouragement of dollar-denominated transactions makes the dollar accessible without requiring U.S. banking relationships. And it generates more stickiness along the line of euro dollars during the Cold War, that kind of there were these USD deposits held outside of U.S. jurisdiction, which had a reinforcing and overlapping effect to lay down extra cement for the Bretton Woods international financial system. I think nuts and bolts, certainly the blockchain is 24/7 every day of the year. And so having a more frictionless system that settles faster than traditional banking systems, it certainly it provides another incentive, let's say, to go towards that and to engage in those payment systems. I'll say the share of reserves right now held by foreign central banks in dollars is dropping. And I think when we put that aside and look at the actual settlement, like the Chinese, going back to my first point, have not been shy about trying to peel off certain countries and have them settle trade in alternative currencies, in the yuan and others. They've made inroads in South America. There's been a lot of talk about the Saudis settling international oil trade outside of the dollar. I think I would welcome comments from panelists too, and I would wager to say there are going to be in the Q&A some hot takes or arguments, but much of our lives in the US is digital. I think there's more work to be done on the digitization front for Americans and also for users of the dollar at the institutional level and the individual level internationally.
Yeah, I think to a lot of the points you just made, I think the United States has historically derived soft power from the dollar status as the default reserve currency and as the settlement currency of choice for global trade. And the proliferation and use of dollar-backed stablecoins extends that soft power further into the digital economy as well. And different trade benefits to it. There's simplification that can happen with respect to international trade finance, enabling faster settlement and cementing the dollar's role in the future.
From the standpoint of dollar dominance, right, and the role of stablecoins in furthering that potentially, it's really interesting to see where the most liquid markets are for stablecoins. And a lot of them tend to be on non-US exchanges. Some of the larger exchanges worldwide are outside of the US. They may operate across border themselves. And when you look at where various of the larger market cap stables are traded and against which assets, you can really see that the dominance of the US dollar, if you were to compute the statistics, US dollar denominated stablecoins against other crypto assets, the statistics that you might come up with might be in line, if not superior, to those around percentage of global trade that's denominated in US dollars.
Yeah, and I'll hop in to add a final thought on that question, which is if you look at the structure of what's going on under the hood, Eitan, Court, you both talked about this, is the dollar as reserve currency previously is called that because we're thinking about global trade flows and central bank reserves. But stable coins are really turning out to be a way for, call it, the US government to go direct to the average person in many nations, right? Like these are individual two-legged human beings. And what is being revealed is that many of them are using the opportunity presented by a dollar stablecoin to opt out of either local currencies or local legal jurisdictions that, if we're being honest, have treated them much more poorly than the United States likely would, and instead into US dollar norms. So this has become a release valve in many places if you look at where they're being used for people who are trapped in either abusive human rights regimes or abusive currency regimes to instead essentially join the United States and the US dollar in a way that was previously not available. Because I'll remind everybody here, one of the interesting facets of US dollar stablecoins is you only need two things to get your hands on one. One is an internet connection, and the other one is something of value to exchange for it. So, for instance, when I was at Paxos, an NYDFS regulated company, we had a stable coin, actually multiple stable coins, and the only country in the world where I was basically 100% certain that no citizens ever owned our stable coin was North Korea. You have to go to the extent of taking the internet away from people to stop them from being able to use this. All right, so on that note, as we start moving into that space, Eitan, I'll come back to you, which is what opportunities do stablecoins present for now extending that dollar access into regions, specifically with limited banking infrastructure, with high inflation, or with other barriers to financial services? And how is that going to shape U.S. influence, call it over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. One thing I'll add before answering that is I think it's the dollar is an instrument of soft power, but also of hard power. I think too often we think of the international financial system in terms of soft power or influence. And there's an excellent op-ed that ran in the Wall Street Journal by Brian Brooks, who's a former acting comptroller of the OCC. And he likened dollar pegged stable coins to, for the financial system, the analogy he drew was to Voice of America in the influence and diplomacy domain. I think soft power seems to be in short supply these days with the elimination of USAID. And let's call it at a time when US diplomacy is fraught in many instances, that it certainly is an instrument in that domain. But I think it's also something very concrete. So getting more directly to your question, I think exactly that. In certain financial systems where the authorities are not the good guy, resistance of authoritarian financial surveillance and being able to move value within borders, across borders quickly, remittances, even things that don't necessarily have a confrontational flair with the authorities, but just transfer value for big use cases. Remittances is a big one. And then the thing that's staring us in the face, I think, is hyperinflation, high inflation worldwide. Currency controls in many countries. If you look at Zimbabwe, inflation has been close to 200%. Argentina, Venezuela is probably one of the most extreme examples. And this is a global trend. Those are isolated examples, but it's very hard for ordinary citizens in those ordinary users in those countries to get access to the financial system. It allows people to store their value and transfer it in a stable form, whether it's pegged to the US dollar, which would be ideal for US interests, or in a different currency.
Yeah, I would also add to that too. I think the humanitarian and development finance use case for stablecoins is very promising. The transparency and efficiency offered by stablecoin and the infrastructure for stablecoins is, I would say, far superior than the current humanitarian finance infrastructure, which has a lot of intermediaries and a lot of risk of abuse that enables potential bad actors to abscond with funds. So the stablecoin infrastructure really can ensure funds reach targeted populations, even in politically unstable situations around the world.
Absolutely. I think for donor transparency, I mean, auditing and keeping track of funds.
Yep.
There was a report, it's dated now from like 2021. I think it was the IMF about corruption and transparency issues in exactly what Court was just describing. And also for the recipients, if you don't have a bank account, as you noted, Austin, all you need is your phone, your mobile device, and something of value, and you can receive funds. You don't need to go to a physical bank location or kind of MSV or anything like that to access funds.
Let me just pick up on the back end of Austin's question. And how might the ability to extend stablecoins to regions with limited banking infrastructure, how might that shape geopolitical influence? I'm going to say I think the geopolitical influence is a power that needs to be organized in order to be exercised. And at present in the US, we lack a nationally agreed policy or regulatory framework for stablecoins. That's part of the genius of our system, is that the states are the laboratories of democracy and of financial regulation. And a lot of what has been proposed in Congress is modeled very heavily on the DFS framework. Kudos to my former agency. But without a nationally agreed upon regulatory framework, I'm struggling to see how stablecoins might present an avenue for the exercise of geopolitical influence.
Yeah, I think
I would agree. I'd say failure to support and regulate stablecoins in the US risks ceding influence to nations that promote non-dollar alternatives. And I would say clear regulatory frameworks ensure that things that are built in the US conform to the values that we have here, the compliance standards that we have here, and then that can carry forth into the broader world.
Yeah, I agree there. The one thing I'd add is those who are promoting dollar alternatives, or those who want to use a dollar pegged instrument, but whose values might be inconsistent with those of the US. So it's a dual pronged beast, I think.
And I would just add here, maybe at the end, contrast with the European Union, which has moved pretty slowly by the description of some involved with the process in standing up the market and crypto assets regulation. But that has stablecoin components to it, and the stablecoins can have a status of admitted and permitted or not. I know the European Securities Market Authority is in the process of refining just what that all means. But contrast where the US is and the leadership position that the US has, as measured by the clear dominance of US dollar denominated stablecoins, second largest crypto asset by market cap, if you were to add the first and the second of those stablecoins together, with the approach that's being taken in Europe, where certain European market players have already announced the intention to withdraw support from certain stablecoins that haven't met with regulatory.
I will add in here, it's becoming increasingly clear that the choice we face in the United States is yes, stablecoins here, or yes, stablecoins elsewhere. I would say no stablecoins has pretty clearly left the barn and is off the table. Even if we've tried to interdict some of those activities, for instance, in the past 4 years under the previous administration, it has not stopped the growth of stablecoins. In some cases, may have even accelerated them. It's possible that the biggest beneficiary so far has been Tether, providing an offshore alternative to what would have otherwise been U.S. onshore demand. So I think we're rapidly reaching the point where policymakers will need to make a decision. So I want to start now by hitting on one of the blockers for the U.S. previously moving forward on this, and a space where I will personally state in the course of my writing and research, I think there are a lot of very deep misconceptions, which is we hear a lot about financial crime in crypto and the failure of anti-financial crime efforts. But again, to go back to the start of our questions, the genesis of that is usually through the lens of something like Bitcoin. So, Court, I'll start with you. How do stablecoins differ from Bitcoin from an anti-financial crime perspective, from a transaction monitoring perspective, and how they can be integrated into the system to actually interdict bad actors?
Sure. I would say there's some key similarities and also some key differences, as you've mentioned. Like other cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, blockchain traceability of stablecoins allows them to be a transparent tool for tracking transactions, which can reduce concerns of illicit finance compared to cash economies, for example, or cryptocurrencies that cannot be effectively traced. So the importance of blockchain analytics from companies like Aton's becomes paramount. Also, stablecoins that are issued by regulated financial institutions like Circle provide regulatory backing and oversight of those institutions that are issuing. I know we'll talk about New York in a little bit, I think, but New York's issued some clear guidance in this area as well. In addition to that, some stablecoins also have functionality to freeze assets on chain for purposes of compliance with sanctions designations or law enforcement orders. And stablecoin issuers also work with law enforcement globally towards these ends pretty effectively.
Eitan, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here nodding along. I think the blockchain is a disaster. If you're a money launderer, it's just, I don't know how many reports and blogs we have to put out before people realize it. I think whether it's in the financial crime domain or kind of more of the state-backed geopolitical type discussions, I think many actors reckon, hey, I'm going to off ramp. By the time you see what I'm doing anyway, I'll already have converted into fiat or into another layer that's much more tricky, let's say, for tracing and disruption. But certainly there is the regulatory piece, but I think what is a game changer, and at times I feel like a little bit a broken record, it's just the immutability and permanence of this layer and unified layer of a ledger, I should say, that is really here forever. It's not a panacea, but it certainly is. I think too much emphasis is placed on, we had after the October 7th attacks, there was a lot of attention and in some cases hysteria around Hamas and use of digital assets by terror groups, which is a legitimate topic to focus on. I think not enough attention at times is placed on what this offers the authorities and what this offers industry in the way of mainstreaming it. So Chainalysis and other companies in the space are very keen to continue providing education as well as showing that you can work with a Circle, you can work with a Tether, you can work with entities in industry to not only identify, but also to freeze and burn smart contracts that are affiliated with all manner of threat actors.
Yeah, I would also add, just from a national security perspective, I think the U.S. should really embrace and lead here to maintain our global leadership and protect our own national security interests. Keeping crypto in the U.S. can further enhance law enforcement capabilities and further secure it as a system. Coinbase, other exchanges have built really world-class AML and counterterrorism financing programs that leverage the power of the blockchain, leverage blockchain analytics tools that sort of enable compliance tooling that's in excess of what is available to traditional financial institutions.
Yeah. I'm just going to add and bring the market's perspective. So everything that you guys have said, I fully agree. And someone who's had responsibility for an anti-financial crime and sanctions compliance program, and someone, Eaton, who's holds probably every certification your company offers, right? The potential to identify and report and block suspicious transactions, problematic transactions with a nexus to sanctioned parties that crypto provides is just tremendous, full stop. And when you add in the fact that stablecoins are issued by companies who generally want to be around tomorrow, and so therefore, whether they're formally licensed or operate with FinCEN registration and don't hold state money transmitter licenses, they're incentivized to cooperate with law enforcement, right? They're incentivized to promote the sound economic and conduct that their assets facilitate, and to minimize the illicit activity that their assets permit. From just a general financial crime potential standpoint, I think it's really important to remember crypto's, 2.6 trillion today? And that's a lot, but it's also de minimis when you think about the true scale of global payments companies and what they facilitate, or the amount of transaction flow that goes through the global banking system. It's really easy to buy VPN services and hosting services and the like that can help facilitate some illicit activity. It's really hard to buy expensive things, right? And it's really hard to large quantities of illicit goods or services. For the last mile, it's great, but for the infrastructure of illicit economic activity, crypto just does not have the market cap to support that.
I'll also hop in here and say, if we look at just observed evidence from the behavior of illicit actors in the space, you can take something like the Bybit hack is incredibly instructive, right? Like the Lazarus Group, who appears to be the perpetrator of that hack, targeted ETH, which is a non-censorable native crypto asset, and then took that ETH and converted it. Now, at this point, it appears to be primarily to Bitcoin. You know what they basically avoided completely in the course of that entire hack? US dollar stablecoins, especially those that are run by onshore US companies. There was no real nexus to Circle, no real nexus to PayPal, no real nexus to Coinbase, no real nexus to Gemini, right? Not to just name a few people. So if I haven't said you in there, that's not an indictment. But what I'm saying is it shows actually when we bring these efforts onshore, it appears to spook the criminals and cause them to avoid things. And when things are out of the reach of United States law enforcement or United States regulators, that appears to be where they cluster to. And again, that is merely observed behavior, right? I'm not making a values judgment in that. I am saying the experiential evidence tells us that is what is going on in this space.
Yeah.
John Court, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, 100%. I'll go quickly. So yeah, sanctions evasion, terror finance, criminal activity, it's highly concentrated on a few non-compliant offshore exchanges. To your point, law enforcement should continue to fully utilize the extensive legal tools that they have available to go after those exchanges today. I think there is a bit of an enforcement gap on things like that. And even with the recent DOJ memo on crypto enforcement, the memo indicated that the focus on platforms that knowingly violate requirements does remain appropriate. Eitan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Court. And also, Austin, what you were describing, it's not a coincidence, I think, use of these decentralized, whatever you want to call it, outside the pale or just harder to reach channels. I would say our latest research shows that most crypto crime is trending towards use of stablecoins, but that just mirrors what's happening in the market. It's not because it's any easier to launder money there. The technology is agnostic, like all novel technologies can be used for good and bad. One example that comes to mind, just along the lines of what you're describing, Austin, is the Central Bank of Russia, which for a long time had, to put it charitably, we can call it an ambivalent position on crypto, given the sanctions architecture and the fact that their reserves are currently in limbo and that they're being squeezed from a trade finance and balance of payments perspective. They had an about face last September, and basically the Duma issued legislation saying, okay, you know what? Actually, maybe we can use Bitcoin and other cryptos for processing of international trade and maybe mining, which we've had a very fraught relationship, Bitcoin, like crypto mining, very fraught relationship with. Maybe we can get something out of this. So it does give you insight into the thinking of adversaries, both at the criminal level and the state-backed level, and that they're being squeezed from a trade finance and balance of payments perspective. They had an about face last September, and basically the Duma issued legislation saying, okay, you know what? Actually, maybe we can use Bitcoin and other cryptos for processing of international trade and maybe mining, which we've had a very fraught relationship, Bitcoin, like crypto mining, very fraught relationship with. Maybe we can get something out of this. So it does give you insight into the thinking of adversaries, both at the criminal level and the state-backed level.
Yeah, and interestingly, as you reference what's going on with Russia, the focus there was on Bitcoin, not US dollar stablecoin. All right. So to that point, I want to actually address one of the other big blockers as we've thought about legislation, which is this perception that stablecoins are somehow unsafe, a threat to the financial system, or prone to collapse. And Robert, you have some personal experience with handling stablecoins, so I want to start with you here, which is let's zoom in a little bit more from the generalized space and instead to stablecoins that have been regulated. And in fact, as you referenced earlier, regulated in ways that are very similar to the kinds of frameworks that are being proposed in US Congress in the Stable Act and the Genius Act in particular. So what is the track record of regulated stablecoins in New York, which I will remind everybody have existed since 2018? And then how does that track record compare to unregulated stablecoins in the larger market?
Yeah, so I'll just start off by saying that coins were approved, I think it was September, October of 2018, and I left in November of 2018. So everything that I'm about to say is based on my outside observation, reading of the guidance, observation of the behavior of the assets. And let's take it from a safety and soundness standpoint. I think as someone who a potential consumer or someone who had advised companies on asset support policies, right? I think the standard that the New York regulation, the New York guidance rather, has set around transparency is spot on, has been very successful. I think when you point to some of the enforcement actions that have been taken by New York, specifically, and there's one asset that had been hypothecated onto another chain, and it was found that the hypothecation wasn't one-to-one. There was effective enforcement action taken to remediate that state of affairs. I think there have been a couple of stablecoin failures and algorithmic stablecoins, I think, and that would point to, I think, by counterexample, the effectiveness of the DFS regulatory framework. I think we risk in thinking about the stablecoin regulatory framework we risk overseeing the broader prudential regulatory framework that New York State has established for crypto issuers, right? So these are generally not bank financial institutions unless they're trust financial institutions, but New York has specific crypto regulatory requirements, including around safety and soundness, including around capitalization, that are tailored to the risks of crypto market activity and would reflect the risks of, stablecoin issuance. So I think it's been remarkably successful. And I point to some of the public comments that the current superintendent's made about the way that she's built up that supervisory function. That supervisory function and the expertise that the department now has, almost 10 years on, the license is about to be, I think, about 10 years old, has really acts as a buttressing factor for New York regulated stablecoins, because it's not just the asset that's regulated, but the issuer and all aspects of that: cybersecurity, anti-financial crime, sanctions, controls, but also consumer protection and financial safety and soundness in the form of prudential capital requirements.
Yeah, I'll pile in there since you referenced it to remind everybody there's only two stablecoins in the world that have grown to above $10 billion of notional and then gone back down to zero. One of them was UST, the algorithmic stablecoin from Terraform Labs, which I think we could all agree was a world-class catastrophe. The other one was BUSD, regulated by the NYDFS, which probably none of you have thought about because it went from 23.5 billion back to zero and nobody noticed. Right? No disruptions, nobody lost money, markets continued to trade normally. And so I would say, as somebody who has a long history in cash stability products, this is not an issue of possible versus not possible. It's a skill issue. And as Robert said, when you have properly regulated entities versus, to be uncharitable, three dudes in a broom closet with no experience with financial markets, you get very different outcomes. All right. So on that note, I want to throw this one over to Court and Eitan. We'll start with Court on this one and then go to Eitan because I want both of your opinions here. How should the U.S. government think about supporting U.S. dollar denominated stablecoins? We'll start at the federal level, and then if you have any views at the state level, because we've seen frameworks now come from New York, obviously, but also you see experiments in Wyoming, Nebraska, likely California. It's starting to proliferate at the state level as well. So I'm curious about your views there.
Yeah, I would say, at least from the federal level, this is something that's still, of course, being debated in Congress. I think in the meantime, it's important that the ecosystem continues to develop as a private market for new innovation. But in whatever Congress and states authorize in the future, at the moment, I would say they're still in the air. But Eitan, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
No, I think in terms of support for dollar denominated stablecoins, I think at the federal level, it's just, I'm trying to zoom out and think about payments regulation and kind of lanes in the road writ large. And just when you think about how we use technology to transfer money, Zelle, Venmo, crypto is not the only thing, but increasingly crypto writ large and stablecoins in particular, there's definitely an appetite. And I think it's state versus federal, like that is one of the main contours I think that will have to be worked out. I also think onshore versus offshore we want U.S. regulated companies, but also we wouldn't want any regulation to the net result of that to end up being permission of use of something pegged to the U.S. dollar, but outside the framework or kind of able to roam freely or run amok even. Yeah.
Yeah, just to tack on additionally, I think our focus at Coinbase and with our industry partners is to try to advocate for legislation that ensures that any new powers at the state or federal level don't impede existing law enforcement tools that enable positive crime fighting partnerships. I want to make sure that some of these rules and regulations don't have unintended consequences of impeding development of a robust crypto economy here or in impeding the relationships that industry has with law enforcement to prevent financial crime.
It does seem like
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Eitan. I'll have a.
I was just going to say, it does seem like we while federal legislation, perhaps like getting across the finish line is not imminent, it does seem like we are getting closer. Many more discussions on imposition of qualifications for reserves, like oversight, state and federal. I would say like redemptions, public disclosure rules. And I also think, I don't know if this leads into another question, but certainly progress internationally could be the fire that activates the US, or at least other countries are moving along, and you could say we're dithering or we're debating without necessarily making tangible progress imminently, but I think that could be an incentive to move more quickly, perhaps.
Yeah, let me just add from a financial regulatory policy standpoint, I think it's really important to recognize that stablecoins, we're talking about them principally as assets here. We've touched on the issuing institutions, right? None of this happens in a vacuum because generally the issuing institutions don't self-custody the reserve assets. Those are custodied at bank financial institutions or at fiduciary institutions. Maybe it's a broker dealer that holds a bunch of the treasuries. The non-crypto supervisory framework, I think, really also needs to advance and develop, right, to understand the risk that these custodian firms these qualified custodians are taking on, and what kind of systemic risk that might pose, right? I think this is some in the Democratic caucus in the Senate have been particularly focused on stablecoins as a systemic risk because, goodness gracious, you could have a run on the stablecoin and that turns into a run on the bank, and all of a sudden your 20 billion in insured deposits is not quite your 20 billion in cash deposits at a bank financial institution turns into a liquidity and solvency crisis for a global systemically or regionally systemically important bank.
I think an interesting aspect on that is somebody who spent a lot of time in global macro markets has been this sort of behavior by the previous stablecoin issuers of holding most of their reserves in bank deposits, which to me was always a little bit odd, right? As somebody who, like, I don't know, ran cash stability trading at JP Morgan, because the first thing you should be doing is trying to get those out of bank deposits and into bankruptcy remote vehicles holding things like T-bills, overnight reverse repurchase agreements, and things of that sort, which are much less systemic. Again, I'll go back to the case of BUSD, where you took 23.5 billion down to zero and no banks cared, right? Literally none. And so again, I would say this is a case perhaps of over-focusing on the ledger technology, right? Because if I took a government money market fund and moved it from an Excel database to an Access database, I don't think anybody would argue that I've dramatically changed the risk to the United States financial system. And so here, I'm hoping, a point for federal regulators is focus more on the economic substance. All right, so speaking of economic substance, because otherwise we're going to run out of time, we have an interesting question from the audience that dovetails with one I was going to ask the panelists. So I'm going to sandwich these two together. So from Benjamin Cole, Ben, nice to see you. Historically, central banks control monetary policy by pulling money in and out of banks through reserve requirements, through interest rate changes, and I'll add other monetary operations. If citizens can begin to introduce their own monetary policy by dollarizing through stablecoins, how might that impact destabilize potentially countries with historical challenges with hyperinflation? And also, net, I'll add, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Court, do you want to start, or Eitan?
Yeah, I can start. I think like when it comes to expanding into some of the markets that historically have high inflation issues like that, I think it does allow folks in these regions to access a stable medium of exchange and a store of value. I think what's important is that for a company like us is that we're working closely with the governments that are in these regions. But I don't know, Eitan, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't have a pithy kind of talking point for that. I would say that this is front and center in a lot of emerging markets, and lots of central banks are reckoning with this, from Nigeria to Turkey and beyond. And I think it's much more complex than saying adoption of dollar-pegged stablecoins is driving capital flight or is tanking our trade, our balance sheet. But yeah, it's something more on the macro side and research. It falls outside the scope of geopolitics in the state-backed threat, transnational organized crime thing, but it is front and center. And I think it gets to some of, Austin, your earlier questions about influence and soft power, and what are the real prospects for the US? Allow me to be annoying and answer a question with a question. What are the real prospects for us to promote this globally? In the absence of regulation, finalized regulation, let's say, it's still getting closer, but not there. Against the backdrop of these dynamics, I think it's going to be a very tough needle to thread. People are using it, and the train has left the station. I think there's no faster way to increase adoption, and that applies to all tech, but certainly for crypto, than to ban it. I think if you look at China's relationship with digital assets and look at adoption trends, the Chinese are engaging with all manner of cryptos on the permissionless side and the centralized. There's use of stablecoins and DeFi and across the gamut. So I think there needs to be more attention paid to that internationally. I also think it's interesting to rotate the board a little and look at what's happening in the US. The prospects for a Fed coin I think that seems, I don't want to say unthinkable, but not a realistic prospect in the US. The idea that the Federal Reserve would be engaging with consumers directly, but certainly as the Fed itself comes under more scrutiny, let's call it, or just the spotlight, and central bank independence is front and center in our own country, I think it's an interesting dynamic to look at domestically too.
Yeah, and I'll hop in and say, again, looking purely at market evidence as somebody who does research in this space, there's not really a threat of dollarization of, say, the Swiss franc or the Sing dollar. So in some ways, the lesson I take from this question is US dollar stablecoins start enforcing a floor of good governance that hopefully will raise over time. And the best way to defend yourself against this problem is simply behave better. If you've been imposing hyperinflation on your citizens, if you've been arbitrarily confiscating their assets in your legal system, they're going to have a very different view of remaining there, right? We'll see large outflows of Turkish lira into US dollar stablecoins in a way that we will not see with Swiss francs.
Right. You don't see a flight away from the Singapore dollar, and it's not a coincidence that they also have robust good governance, but also robust legislation and lanes in the road for this tech.
All right, so go to our set. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Awesome. Let me turn that on its head and say, for countries that choose to combat hyperinflation through the use of a currency board, where they maintain non-natively issued offshore reserves, right, and link that to the monetary supply, the use of stable coins could actually be a boon for macroeconomic policy and fiscal policy.
I agree. All right, second question from a panelist. So the block today is reporting of a stablecoin turf war, Bank of America, Tether, Circle, the usual suspects, with the framing of pitting TradFi actors against digital asset firms. I want to ask the panel, do you agree with this characterization? And also importantly, how much sway do we really think these lobbying efforts have on the Hill?
So I think, at least from our perspective, we would not consider this a turf war. Banks participate in the legislative process. We have our own efforts, and we would welcome that and frankly expect it.
I think of it as in terms of fostering payments pluralism, right? Especially in the US, we have a tremendous banking system, but we also have the world's largest payments companies, and we've got a lot of them. And so I don't think it's a question of either or. I think clearly it wouldn't be in the American financial regulatory tradition to say there's a one solution here. In the European Union, the digital euro project is advancing, and they're looking at the equivalent of digital bearer instruments under 500 euros. That's in no way, shape, or form going to deplatform fiat currency, deplatform other cryptos. I think might increase the level of competition, but there's room for everybody, right? And I think it's only healthy if in the US financial system, bank financial institutions and payments financial institutions have a voice in forming.
Yeah, and I'll say as a closing part there, because I know we're about to be at time, I would also say at some of the larger institutions, I'm not even certain they speak with one voice. If you look at a Bank of America or a JP Morgan, there are like a proliferation of views about how things should be done, even internally, much less expressed externally. And I think you've hit on an excellent point, which is one of the most important things for us is continuing to allow this space to evolve. An example I use in my class of where these things can go wrong is if we all paused in 1996 and said, aha, AOL, that's how email should work, and froze it there. nobody would be happy. And I say that as somebody who used AOL, so sorry, guys. But punchline, I think this has been an excellent discussion, a lot of food for thought for people here. We are, however, at time, so I will pause here and hand it back over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Austin. And first of all, let me reiterate my deepest gratitude to Coinbase for sponsoring this series, which I think is really important. And also to our moderator, Austin, thank you for joining us here today, as well as our panelists, Robert, Court, and Eitan. Really appreciated your insights. I learned a lot. And if any of you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, I have pasted in the chat our website. You can sign up for our mailing list at trumancenter.org, and we'll let you know about the next conversations that we're having. There will be another session in this particular series, and I'm really excited about that one too. So thanks again, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you next time.